Polaris Project was created to put human traffickers out of business. We strive to eradicate human trafficking and modern slavery from our world. We're building a movement in the United States against human trafficking, which involves raising public awareness and building a grassroots constituency. We're also building a national response system so that communities are ready to respond to human trafficking anywhere in the United States. Our current objective is to focus on the United States as a model, to prove that it is possible to make real progress in the fight against modern slavery. We are working to unite all the actors in the anti-trafficking field in the United States into a cohesive national response. Once we lay the groundwork by advocating for stronger laws and ensuring that frontline professionals are trained, we scale our impact by operating the country's national human trafficking hotline and fielding more calls. For example, we started publicizing the hotline number at truck stops, and we've had over 240 truckers call in and report seeing children being sold for sex at truck stops across America. The national hotline is the single most effective way to help identify more trafficking victims and get them out of trafficking situations. By scaling the impact of the national hotline, we'll be able to identify more trafficking rings and eradicate the crime. When the U.S. government decided to create a national human trafficking hotline, Polaris Project was the organization they selected to run it. As the national hotline, we are uniquely positioned to be able to leverage the response infrastructure that exists in hundreds of communities across the U.S. We partner with and leverage the efforts of social service providers, federal and local law enforcement, and elected officials to publicize the national hotline number, raise the hotline call volumes, and ultimately learn about more criminal trafficking networks. Law enforcement depends on Polaris Project to send a constant flow of tips about trafficking operations so that they know where to investigate. Now that the national hotline is up and running, trafficking victims have a place to call and seek help, and we have a way of learning about the thousands of trafficking cases all across America. There are multiple factors that lead to the success of Polaris Project. One factor is that we focus on all forms of human trafficking, which gives us a wide and broad scope of our mission. We're not limited to any single type of trafficking because we work on all forms. Another factor is that we've designed our organization with a multi-intervention strategy and comprehensive approach, so we're working from multiple angles to combat human trafficking. All of our programs learn from each other and give us a well-rounded perspective. We also directly serve survivors of trafficking, so our knowledge of the issue is grounded in the reality of what survivors are actually facing. When we give a training or advocate for a new law, people immediately realize that Polaris Project has a level of insight that is taken seriously. We've taken a collaborative approach in our work, partnering with hundreds of other agencies and leveraging others' strengths. Lastly, we've shown that we're about more than responding to human trafficking or raising public awareness. We're actually about putting traffickers out of business and eradicating the crime. Polaris Project measures its success through a number of different metrics. Our main metric asks, is trafficking actually being reduced? And how many trafficking operations are being shut down? We also measure our impact by the number of victims that we've identified and served. For our policy advocacy work, we measure success by the number of laws passed that increase protections for victims and penalties for traffickers. For the national hotline, we measure success by the number of calls we receive, the number of victims we help get out of trafficking situations, and the number of leads we report to law enforcement. Polaris Project often talks about our 4 core program areas: the National Human Trafficking Hotline, our Policy Advocacy Program, our Training Program, and our Direct Victim Services work. What many people don't know is that we also have a Leadership Development Program designed to train the next generation of anti-trafficking leaders. We call it our Fellowship Program. Over 400 fellows from all over the world have come to Polaris Project to be trained in how to combat human trafficking in their communities. Polaris Fellowship alumni are now embedded all throughout the anti-trafficking field, working in government, in law enforcement, and in other NGOs. When people hear about the size and staff of Polaris Project, they don't realize that we have over 50 full-time fellows working with us each year, expanding our reach. Another thing that people don't know about Polaris is the amount of data and intelligence that we have gathered about trafficking networks. We learn this information through the national hotline or through directly working with survivors. We plan to analyze this data for trends to help understand the cutting edge of how traffickers are changing their game. No one that we know of in the field is gathering this information like we are, because we're uniquely positioned to collect it. Polaris Project has achieved many important accomplishments in the fight against trafficking since our founding in 2002. On the national hotline, we have fielded over 45,000 calls and helped to identify over 5,000 trafficking victims. Through our policy program, we have helped pass 3 major federal bills on trafficking. When we first started doing policy work on the state level, only 4 states made human trafficking a crime. Now that number has increased to 48. Through our victim services program, we have directly served over 500 victims of trafficking. Lastly, through our training and community capacity building program, we have trained over 50,000 people to learn how to identify and respond to human trafficking. One challenge we constantly face is that human trafficking is a dark issue that some people don't want to talk or hear about. Sometimes it turns people away to talk about this kind of suffering in our world. The word slavery can also be a challenge, because people have lots of emotions and feelings about it from our country's history with slavery. Human trafficking as a term also has its challenges. People often think it means smuggling, or that it involves moving people from place to place. Some people think that trafficking only happens in other countries, and they don't realize that it happens here in the United States as well. If Polaris Project had additional resources, one of the first things we'd do is expand the reach and impact of the National Human Trafficking Hotline. We'd be able to field many more calls. Another thing we'd do is launch a data synthesis arm of Polaris Project to analyze all the information we're learning through the hotline and package it into trend analysis for the field. Our goal is to expand our programs beyond the United States and launch a number of global programs. These include launching a global human trafficking hotline, mapping out everyone in the world working on human trafficking and uniting them into a global response infrastructure, and expanding the reach of our policy and training work to other countries as well. This integration will allow Polaris to function as a global command center for the anti-trafficking field. Ultimately, this will enable us to put more human traffickers out of business and eradicate these transnational criminal networks from our world. There are a number of cities and states in the U.S. that don't have or don't use a human trafficking hotline. As the national hotline, we could fill these gaps and function as the local or state human trafficking hotline for anywhere in the U.S. Now that we've built the National Human Trafficking Hotline for the U.S., we've learned a lot about how to launch and operate a national human trafficking hotline, and we could take this knowledge to help other countries launch similar efforts. The future vision would be to launch a single global human trafficking hotline that would be available to anyone in the world who is looking to get out of a human trafficking situation or report a tip about human trafficking that they have encountered.